Hey Hollow Dwellers, welcome back to Jester's Hollow, where we dig into the psychology, design and the hidden story behind the games that refuse to leave our brains. Today, we are walking into Bullworth Academy, not to talk about Jimmy Hopkins, but to stare straight into the eyes of Gary Smith, the sociopathic boy who wants to own the school's soul. Because Gary isn't just a good villain, he feels like a prototype for the charismatic monsters Rockstars would keep building long after the bells rang at Bullworth. Bully drops us into Bullworth Academy, a grim boarding school where every hallway is a pressure cooker and every corner hides under hierarchy. You play as Jimmy Hopkins, a kid abandoned by the gate by his parents and dumped into a system that has already decided that he is a problem to be managed, not a person to be understood. The school is split into cliques: bullies, preps, nerds, greasers, jocks, and exiled townies outside the wall, each with their own turf, fashion and rituals. In the middle of this mess, the first friend who steps forward is Gary Smith, a fellow student who offers Jimmy a tour, a plan, a smile that feels a little too confident for a newcomer. Official character bios and fan analysis describe Gary as highly intelligent, narcissistic, and openly cruel, with hints of diagnosed disorder and history of behavioral issues. From the very first scene, he is framed as someone who understands Bullworth's social ecosystem better than anyone else, and enjoys pulling apart just to see what happens. That's all the setup we need. The rest of the story doesn't live in the lore dumps, but in Gary's choices, the mission he wires together, the psychological wake he leaves behind. Here is the core idea. Gary Smith isn't just a bully, he is a budding social scientist of cruelty, running experiments on people around him just to test how far manipulation can go without getting his own hands dirty. Where most cool villains want control to feel power, Gary wants to control because watching people dance on invisible strings is entertaining to him. Rockstar builds him not as a physical threat, but as a psychological predator who weaponizes information, insecurity, and institutional hypocrisy. In the early missions, Gary plays the role of a guide, walking Jimmy through courtyard, mocking weaker students, and breaking down each clique as if he is narrating a wildlife documentary. He explains who rules which corner, who can be humiliated safely, and which line you cannot cross without being crushed. But notice how camera work and staging always keep him behind or beside Jimmy, never fully committing to the chaos he provokes. He pushes Jimmy toward Russell, the leader of the bullies, convincing him that beating Russell is the fastest way to earn respect in Bullworth. Gary stands on the sideline while Jimmy gets his teeth kicked in. He only steps back into the frame once the dust has settled and to reclaim the role as helpful strategist. The early pattern: Gary designs the conflict, Jimmy takes the risk. This skeleton key for the understanding how everything he does for the rest of the game. In fan discussions and villain catalogs, Gary is repeatedly described as sociopathic, charming when he needs to be, incapable of genuine empathy, and excited by the idea of breaking people just to prove that he can. He is fascinated with the ruling the school, but what he really wants is to see what happens when the structure collapses, and he is the only one holding the map. In that sense, Bullworth isn't just his home, it's his experiment, his sandbox, and his first small-scale empire. Gary's psychology is built from tiny repeated cruelties, not a single grand confession. Listen how he talks to Pete. He constantly belittles him, questions his masculinity, and hints that Pete should be grateful just to be allowed in his orbit. This isn't simple teasing, it's a power exercise, conditioning Pete to accept humiliation as a price of proximity. When he calls Jimmy friend, in a way it feels less affectionate and more like applying a label to a new toy. He narrates other students' flaws like a file he has memorized, rattling off their weakness with casual contempt. When he insults people, there is no hesitation or regret, just the satisfaction of someone confirming that they are the smartest person in the room. Psychology-focused fans point out how neatly Gary aligns with sociopathic traits, manipulative charm, lack of remorse, and shallow attachments, and need for stimulation through escalating cruelty. He does not simply want revenge on Bullworth, he wants to see what happens if he removes every safety rail and watch everyone else scramble. That thrill of escalation, the need to push situations from harmless prank to genuine danger, danger is what makes him feel more frightening than your typical school bully stereotype. Even his self-presentation hints at deeper instability. Material from character wikis and fan write-ups reference him admitting to being on medication and having a condition which he uses as both a shield and a weapon. He jokes about being off the meds and frame his own volatility as something other people should work around rather than something he should control. It is another layer of manipulation, turning mental health into a get out of consequences card while still fully owning his choices. Crucially, Gary doesn't need a tragic origin monologue to justify his behavior. The game refuses to hand him a neat trauma excuse. Instead, Rockstar lets his actions speak. He hurts people because he enjoys it, he lies because it is effective, and escalates because stability bores him. The moral emptiness, especially in a kid, is what gives him that horror edge. One of the most elegant things about Bully's structure is how each chapter feels like Jimmy solving a clique, only for us to realize later that Gary has been quietly rigging each of the arcs to serve his own plan. The bullies, preps, greasers, nerds, jocks are not just fractions to be pacified. They are ammunition Gary loads and fires at Jimmy at carefully chosen moments. Every time Jimmy wins, Gary makes sure he loses something. A reputation, an ally, a little more trust from the adults. Which Russell and the bullies frames the fight as a rite of passage, a way for Jimmy to prove that he is not a prey. With preps, he takes advantage of class snobbery, fanning the flames between blue-collar greasers and rich kids who think everything is beneath them. With Johnny and the greasers, he feeds jealousy and insecurity around Lola, using that fear of betrayal to push Johnny into an open war with Jimmy. By the time Jimmy has technically united the most of the school, Gary has already seeded rumors that Jimmy is becoming a tyrant on his own right. He tells the clique leaders that Jimmy is simply using them, that he has grown drunk on power, and that the only way to save Bullworth is to turn on the boy they once followed. It is a perfect inversion. The would-be peacekeeper framed as the new bully, while the true architect of chaos slips further into the shadows. The breaking point comes when Gary manipulates Jimmy into participating in a high-profile vandalism, like Town Hall incident, that hands the faculty all the evidence they need to brand Jimmy as the school's core problem. He understands how institutions work. They respond not to invisible manipulation but to whoever their cameras and reports say threw the first punch. So Gary positions Jimmy as the visible troublemaker and himself as the ghost, untouchable because he never signs his work. Once Jimmy is expelled, the Bullworth is in chaos. Gary goes one step further and reaches outside the school walls to recruit the Townies. The Cliques the system has already sewed up and spat out. These are former students expelled, suspended, or broken by Bullworth rules, now living in industrial ruins and nursing a deep hatred for the academy. Gary sees their anger not as something to heal, but as a resource to mine. Story breakdowns and mission summaries describe how Gary convinces the Townies that Jimmy is the face of everything wrong with Bullworth, turning their race towards one person actually trying to stabilize the school. He talks up Jimmy's alliance with Cliques as a proof that Jimmy is just another self-appointed tyrant. In exchange, Gary offers the Townies a chance to watch the academy burn from the inside. What makes this especially cruel is that Gary is using the same logic the school used on them. Treat people as tools, then discard them when they become inconvenient. To Gary, Townies are not comrades, they are remote-controlled chaos. Bodies to throw at Bullworth's walls until something cracks. It is Jimmy, not Gary, who finally levels with Edgar and the others, explaining how they have been used by another would-be tyrant. In the late-game missions leading up to final showdown, Jimmy fights two Townies, reaching Edgar, and exposes Gary's manipulation for what it is. Only then do the Townies flip and join Jimmy, turning the final weapon back onto its creator. By the time everyone marches back to Bullworth, the school is united not by Jimmy's charisma alone, but by the shared hatred of the one person who has exploited them all. The final climax of Bully is a pure rockstar theater, a familiar location transformed into a battlefield, every fraction colliding at once, and the true villain finally cornered at the symbolic top of his world. In the final showdown, Gary and his followers storm the school, take Headmaster Cabelsnitch hostage, and send the entire campus into a riot mode. Jimmy, backed by every clique and the Townies, climbs through the chaos and confronts the boy who started it all. On the rooftop, Gary finally drops the last of his mask. When he confessed, he basically admits he did it all because he can. Because seeing morons dance for him is the only thing that makes his life interesting. There is no tragic flashback, no plea for understanding, just a raw contempt and a smug satisfaction of someone who thought he would never be caught. Even here, he tries to twist the narrative, taunting Jimmy that any victory will only get Jimmy punished harder by the adults. The fight ends with both of them clashing through the rooftop into the headmaster's office, the literal fall from grace straight into the very authority he tried to outplay. In the afternoon, testimonies from students and the staff exposes his role as the unseen architect of the year's chaos. Cabelsnitch expels Gary, while Jimmy, ironically the kid who started as the labeled troublemaker, is recognized as one who pulled the school back from the edge. Gary's grand experiment fails not because his logic was flawed, but because his ego couldn't stand a world where he didn't hold the strings. He escalated until every clique, every exile, even the system he manipulated turned against him. For a character obsessed with being the smartest person in the room, his downfall is tragically simple. Sooner or later, everybody notices the hand that keeps shoving them towards the cliff. So why does Gary stick with players long after the credits roll in a game filled with slapstick humor and cartoon violence? Because he feels like an early test case for a kind of villain Rockstar would keep refining, charming on the surface, rotten on the underneath, and terrifying good at making systems work for them. Scale up Gary's age, give him more territory, more weapons, and more years to practice, and you could easily imagine him sitting comfortably alongside the studio's later crime lords and corrupt leaders. What makes him so effective is the gap between his environment and his mindset. He is operating on a ruthless, almost adult level of manipulation inside the confined world of a boarding school built on rules, punishment, and reputation. That contrast, school uniforms holding a would-be tyrant, creates a dissonance that feels distinguishably possible. Fan essays and character analysis keeps coming back to Gary as one of the Rockstar's most realistic villains, because everything he does is horrifying without leaving the realm of possible. No magic, no superpowers, just charisma, cruelty, and deep understanding of how fear and shame moves people. He is the kind of person we hope is rare in real life, but secretly fear is more common than we want to admit. Under all the cartoon punches and banana peel comedy, Bully hides a quieter horror story about what happens when a place like Bullworth creates a perfect habitat for someone like Gray Smith. The school's obsession with discipline over understanding, punishment over support, and image over the truth leaves a huge blind spot. Gary lives inside those blind spots, thriving as long as his violence stays technical and indirect. Bully never shows what happens to Gary after expulsion, and in a way, that is the most unsettling part. Fan speculation threads imagine future where he ends up in prison, in therapy, or climbing the ranks of something far worse than Schoolyard Cliques. The game cuts away before we see which Rockstar timeline he follows, but the implication is clear. Monsters like Gary do not appear out of nowhere, they are cultivated. Gary is the exact point where psychological horror meets social critique. He is not the strongest fighter, the biggest threat, or even the most visible antagonist. He is the proof that scariest person in the room might be the one who never threw a single punch. Because in Bullworth, the real final boss isn't the kid with the biggest fist. It is the one who exactly knows which strings to pull to make everyone else swing them. So, what do you think? Does Gary Smith deserve a spot alongside Rockstar's greatest villain? Or is he even worse because he's still just a kid. Drop your thoughts, theories, and favorite Bullworth nightmares in the comments. Every story about this place makes the hollow a little louder. If you want more deep dives into the quietly terrifying minds behind your favorite games, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that bell. Until next time, watch the ones who never get their hands dirty.